We're live.
And the cheer has started. Welcome to Viral Transmission.
Woo!
Starting with the Vancouver Healthcare Workers Cheer.
I'll go outside and join my neighbor. Just hear him what. Yeah, it's been getting significantly louder here over the past week. Like with some of my neighbors purposefully set off their car alarm.
Yeah, I have that here too.
Car alarms go off. People.
It's a great time to steal a car.
It really is. You're welcome, Eskimiel. We're gonna do it again. That's kind of. I've been trying to get myself away from ladies and gentlemen. That's one that I actually picked up at a burlesque performance and fell in love with. I'm gonna try to keep you. My pleasure. Yeah, we're having that Discord sound reduction cut out. We should have tested this. I think you can turn it off. So maybe face again. Just wash my hands. Yeah, my neighbor's kids love to bring out pots and pans and bang on. Having a great time with it.
It's a long one tonight.
Yeah.
There's so much appreciation.
There's a lot of appreciation.
Well, it's good to see this when...
Got a frying pan just going.
Why we're holding things up to our cameras.
All right, I think we're starting to fade.
All right.
Okay, boys, I'm going to bring it back inside.
Silence my phone. Oh, no. That's not a Cthulhu mug, that's Toren's true. And
We're back.
Good. Name tags. Here we go. I can't move the name tags easily.
Oh, we got some folks already in the chat. This is good.
Greetings.
Nice.
Greetings, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Welcome to episode 6 of Viral Transmissions. I'm Joe Fulgham. With me, of course, as usual, is Dr. Rob Tarzwell and Toren Atkinson, who has himself into a Cthulhu mug. Oh, there
Here I am. I'm alive.
There's his humanoid
He's not
form.
being dragged down to those infernal depths.
Our guest...
with us
Go ahead, Rob.
is Sasha Maleki, who is a clinical pharmacist at Nanaimo Regional Hospital on Vancouver Island. Welcome to the show.
Welcome, welcome.
And
Thank you guys for having me.
Oh, hey, thanks for being here. So just to start with, why don't you explain to the folk, I'm sure everybody's heard of a pharmacist and probably interacted with one at least once in their life. Yeah. Why don't you explain what a clinical pharmacist is and how that's distinct from, say, a retail pharmacist?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you guys for having me. I just wanted to, I guess, clarify what you just said.
Sure.
So a clinical pharmacist is anyone who works in a hospital and who works on a clinical floor specifically. So our jobs are still to be medication experts and to be medication stewards, which means to make sure people are using medications correctly. And I'm there to help physicians make the correct medication decisions, So we get a diagnosis from the physician, and then we have our own assessment that we make, and we recommend meds that we think would be the best for the patient. And we're also there to do the regular job that a pharmacist does, which is to make sure medications are safe when they're ordered. We check for side effects. We come up with monitoring plans, answer questions, and yeah, just there to make sure that all the meds are being given safely and effectively.
When we first chatted, one of the things that you mentioned sort of several topics, and you can kind of jump into these in whatever order you wanted. But I think one of the very first thing you mentioned was supply stress in terms of COVID-19 and pharmaceutical compounds. And I'm wondering if that's something that you wouldn't mind kind of diving into a little bit.
Yeah. So there's a lot to talk about there.
All right, the floor is yours.
And so I think the first place to start is how British Columbians might feel a drug shortage to begin with. So drug shortages are kind of broadly defined as when the demand is not able to keep up with the supply is unable to keep up with the demand. That can happen for a variety of reasons. It could be as a result of a raw material not being available. And raw materials would include the physical ingredients that are needed to mix the drugs together in their plants. It could also include cases where there's a lack of ability to actually ship medication from a plant to its intended source. So an example was when the hurricanes happened in Puerto Rico, a major drug manufacturing plant was shut down, and that cut off a lot of drug supply for the US and us. And the last case is where, kind of related to COVID, is where there's massive hoarding, and now we have shortages because all the supply has been used up. We don't have enough to distribute to everybody. And it's not like there are one factory for Tylenol, one factory for Advil. There's only a handful of factories in Canada, and each factory goes through a cycle of what they make. So they make one drug, they switch to a next one, and they switch to a next one, and they move on and move on. It gets more complex because Canada doesn't actually make all their meds in-house, so to speak. We outsource from China, from India, parts in Europe and the US. And it's about, the data I have from the US is about 28% of the US drug market is made within the United States, and the rest comes from other parts of the world. So when China had their massive outbreak of COVID, plants had to shut down, and that's what resulted in some key drug shortages that patients from all over felt.
Did the manufacturer shut down because of there wasn't an essential service? Like, I'm not sure how that would work. Is it just like there's just too many people who are sick?
I'm not entirely clear as to why that they shut down. I think it was to do with extreme social distancing. I'm not really clear, honestly.
Everyone has to be 2 factories apart from each other.
What's that?
Everyone has to be 2 factories apart from each other.
Yeah, basically. And yeah, I'm not entirely sure why. I know here factories are an essential service, and they would stay open. Right. The extent of how much staff they could accommodate is probably going to depend on the floor space of each factory. But it's tough to say. And the one thing I'll mention to all the listeners and to you guys is tough to say is kind of the overarching theme of all the evidence that we have with COVID right now and all the answers to your burning questions. We just don't know. And I can get to the studies and all that and kind of the preface I'll make about that, but I apologize if my answers are frustrating, but we simply don't have a lot of info on things. So don't shoot the messenger.
We don't know.
Yeah.
But we can kind of shape the contours of the known or the unknown and kind of constrain it and confine it somewhat, at least.
Yeah.
For some reason, everybody on the Facebook groups that I'm on just don't like that answer.
Well, we've been fortunate that whenever in medicine we've answered a lot of the big questions. So in infectious disease, we know a lot of answers for a lot of things. It's these novel cases like COVID-19 that it's pulled the rug out of under the entire system, and it's challenging. And there's a lot of things that we're trying to think, okay, we have it under control, and then this next thing comes up, and now it's scrambling to solve that issue and move on to the next one. So it's difficult to live through it. That in retrospect, we'd say, oh yeah, of course, that made sense, or that made sense. But there's a lot of testing and a lot of thought that went into that claim that says, okay, yes, this makes sense, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, everything's incredibly obvious in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, exactly. And I also want to mention, I'm by no means an infectious disease expert at all, actually. I work in neuropsychiatry and internal medicine, but through the guidance of our infectious disease experts within Island Health and across the province, I've tried to compile as much info as I can to talk about this. And so obviously, there will be things I just simply don't know. That is, there probably are answers out there, but I'll try my best, and I can always refer you to the correct sources as needed.
So just before we jump into that, one thing I read, maybe you're able to confirm or not, is that a lot of the precursor molecules that go into modern pharmaceuticals particularly seem to come from a few factories in Wuhan. So that was almost like a double blow. The fact that the outbreak, what started there, was the worst there, and that just happens to be where all these factories are that are critical for global pharmaceutical production.
I have heard of that, which is really unfortunate. In terms of what are the key ingredients, it's really difficult to say because drug manufacturing is just like making a car. And I'm quoting one of our Canada's top drug shortage experts. I can't remember her name right now, but I'll make sure I get that later. She compared the whole process to car manufacturing, where the steering wheel leather is made in Alberta, and then the drivetrain could be designed in Ontario but assembled in Wuhan, for example, and it's so difficult to say what's coming from there. So I'm not sure, because it's important to distinguish an important precursor molecule for what drug, right, or what class of drugs. And so, and more importantly, is that a class of drug that we're affected by in terms of a shortage? So it's kind of, again, it's difficult to say, tough to answer.
These specific shortages that you're feeling, say in Nanaimo, or that you're just aware of across the country or across the continent?
Yeah, so the most important one that is related to COVID is salbutamol. And so that's also known as Ventolin. If there's any American listeners, it's known as albuterol. So this shortage is problematic for a lot of reasons. Number one is this drug is primarily used in asthma and COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which are lung conditions. The challenge with this is that there's still millions of Canadians who have these conditions and who need these inhalers. So when there's shortages of these life-saving medications, frankly, they automatically get affected. In the case of COVID, COVID, as we all know, is when patients get really sick, they have difficulty breathing, and so we use salbutamol or Ventolin to try and help these patients breathe. I haven't, in my so far short career, I haven't seen an effort to ever recycle medications, but that's what we're having to do now with salbutamol. So the way it works is that it's a plastic delivery device that you place into your mouth. There's a canister that actually contains the medication. So what we used to do is whenever we give that inhaler for the patient, it would stay with the patient. When the patient gets discharged, we then discard the medication. Now what we're doing is we're saying, okay, don't throw it out, place it into this bin, give it to pharmacy, and the pharmacy will go and clean them. And I'm not saying that's wrong, it's just this is the extent of how we're being tested with this. Because it's really important to remember that we're not just saving it for COVID patients specifically. We've actually been really lucky in not only Nanaimo Hospital, but the island and BC and Canada compared to the rest of the world. But we still have a lot of aging people who still come in with COPD exacerbations, who come in who can't breathe. We still need to treat those people. So that's the biggest and the biggest strain I've working in the hospital.
Yeah, I had asthma as a child, and I had a
yeah, and it's and you know I used to work in a QC. It was never a question of, oh, do we have salbutamol stock? Never. It was just there. You had boxes of it. Now it's like hand sanitizer. It's just you have to be really careful with how often you're using it, and yeah, it's just it's a weird time.
We have a few people mentioning shortage of benzos. One is ischemia is medical city and
I personally haven't heard of any shortages of this here. It's not on my radar medications that we've been asked to conserve or to watch out for. And actually, this kind of ties into my role, directly ties into my role as a pharmacist, is our role is to help do what's called a therapeutic substitution. So just because there's one medication that's meant to treat one thing, doesn't mean that there's others that can't do the same job. So our job is when one pill goes down, we try and find something else we can use instead. And so for salbutamol, one of the alternatives that we have is a drug called Atrovent or ipratropium, which we do have much more supply of, but we're still being careful with supply. So for the benzo question, unless there's a wide shortage of every benzo, I don't see how they could totally be out. Because I think in Canada, we have, 12 or 15 different benzos that are licensed for use. So in the States, it's probably the same, if not a little more. So I would maybe, it might be a bit of media sensationalism that they're saying we're short of benzos. Maybe it's the specific one that they're short of. But yeah.
Well, now that we're talking about drugs, I think you want to talk about chloroquine.
Yeah. So
can we talk about how well does that work for?
So just before we get to the drugs and everything, there's a couple things I really should just hammer home, and this is kind of talking about what we always hear. Oh, there's evidence for this. There's evidence for that. Okay, let's just talk about what is actually evidence here. So evidence means that we have people who've looked at something, who ran some sort of experiment. There are different kinds of experiments. There's experiments where we just watch someone go through a treatment, and we write about it. We call that a case report. Then there's other experiments which we look at a group of people who've gone through a similar thing, and then we look at that after the fact, and we call those observational studies. Then there's the prospective trial, the ones that we think something will work, we want to compare it to something else, and then we see what happens over a defined period of time. And that's the best example of that would be what's called an RCT, or randomized controlled trial. And ideally, you would have something placebo or a dummy pill or a dummy intervention to compare it to. So on to COVID. The quality of these trials while they can be called evidence, some of them really should not be. There's a number of issues with these trials. In general, what healthcare providers look for is, can I look at this trial and say, this was designed properly? Which means, did they clearly define who they wanted to include, what their outcomes were? So what did they specifically want to measure? And more importantly, how did they measure it? Then they want to, or a good trial would then specify, here is the period of time I want to look at it. And they try and give as much detail as possible. These trials, sorry, I can't even call them trials. These reports, rather, didn't do that in many of the cases. They had very different definitions for things. In some cases, the definition of cure was different. So some studies defined cure of COVID as the symptoms went away. Some said that they tested negative using the NP swab. Others had different definitions based on blood tests or assays that they look at. So that already is a problem there. The next thing is that the studies don't include the same kinds of people. So in COVID, the easiest way to classify is a mild patient who has, you can call it your run-of-the-mill flu-like symptoms, then who stays at home and they get better on their own without any serious medical intervention. Then there's the people who get hospitalized but don't require ICU. Then there's those that require ICU admission. And within that, it gets really complicated. But my point being is that the trials are all over the place as to who they actually. So I know that as a public, and especially for an infectious disease, we want an easy pill. We want something that you can take, like your classic amoxicillin, that red and yellow capsule. You go to your doctor, they're like, here you go, take it for 7 days. You might have diarrhea, but you'll be fine, right? We want that easy answer. And unfortunately, it really doesn't seem like we have that right now for COVID-19.
All we got is the diarrhea.
Oh, what's that?
All we got is the diarrhea.
Basically, yeah. And unfortunately, all we drugs is that we know they cause side effects, and that's pretty much it. But I'll get into the studies. So chloroquine.
How long does if I can interrupt just for a second, how long does a typical drug test take?
That's a great question. So this kind of ties in with your thing about supply. To give you an example, so the process of getting one drug approved can take up to 10 years, 10 whole years from the time that the idea was brought in someone's head to when it goes out into the market and you see commercials on TV. And it also takes about $1 billion. So just it goes to show you that it can take a while to do these trials. Depending on the drug, the length of trial could be anywhere between 8 to 12 weeks to up to 10 years for some trials, depending on the drug. So in infectious disease trials, it really depends on what the disease is. So if it's a pneumonia, for example, they might run the trial, the treatment course rather, for 2 weeks, but the duration of the trial could be 2 years because they're going to try and get people who can into the trial. Hopefully that answers your question there. Yeah. And so that brings me to the next point about the number of people in trials. Not a lot of people have been studied. And by not a lot, I mean 20, 40, 100, 200. Sure, that sounds like a lot, but really considering claims that they're making, it's not that much because we need way more people to definitively say that I have a decent sample size of the population I sample, and I can make claims off of that based off of the number of people that I have. So that's the challenge that we have. And notice how I had to preamble 6 minutes of preamble, because it's really important you guys understand that why everyone's up in arms about these trials and these drugs, because on the surface you read a headline, it says, oh yeah, reduce mortality by this, but there's so many asterisks to that, and that's what I want to hope to unpack with you guys today.
Yeah, right. I'm sure that if you grabbed a group of a random 100 COVID patients and gave some peanut butter, you'd be able to go, look, the ones we gave peanut butter got better because we don't have a big enough sample size. Randomly, some got better, and it happened to be the ones that peanut butter. Yeah.
And peanut butter will always make 63% of people more happy anyway.
Look, if I'm going to die of COVID, I want to do it while eating peanut butter. I will admit that.
Well, I can't eat peanut butter. I have a severe nut allergy.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's the other percentage.
Yeah. And the best example of what you just said that my geography teacher, Mr. Bolognese, taught me in grade 12 was, if you look at the number of elephants in a sub-Saharan African country, there happens to be a lot of cases of HIV in those countries. So you could say that elephants cause HIV. Clearly, that's not the case, right? Correlation is not causation. And so that's the really important thing to remember, is that just because we gave a drug to this person, we have to have very good controls in those trials to get away from correlation and to say this is causative, as in the thing I did this. It caused the thing I wanted to happen. So with that said, let's talk about hydroxychloroquine. So why all the rage about hydroxychloroquine? I'm not entirely sure. So it's been propped up by the media and by certain world leaders, not mentioning names, but it's become a problem to the point that there have been reactions from the College of Pharmacists, from the College of Physicians, the College of Nurses, basically anyone who has a in the saying, please don't hoard this medication. Don't go crazy over this, because we just don't think it works. So hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, they're similar medications. They're typically used, the chloroquine is used for malaria, hydroxychloroquine can be used for malaria, but we do see it more often in rheumatoid arthritis and for something called SLE or lupus for short. So that's where we see it mainly. Now, the reason why, in my mind, why they decided to, because it's a widely available medication. It's inexpensive, taken once or twice a day, depending on how it's dosed. And you'd think, hey, it has some antiviral properties. Maybe, let's give it a try. So that's kind of where it came from. Of all the therapies that they've investigated, hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine receive the most attention by far. I'm not entirely clear. A lot of trials have been published about this drug. So to go over it, essentially there are a number of trials that did different interventions. The interventions they did were not placebo controlled, which means that they didn't necessarily have hydroxychloroquine as one arm and placebo as the other, which that in itself already is a red flag for me, because I'm not okay with saying that we need, or the claim that you're making is good because you just studied the one drug and some people get better. There weren't necessarily placebos in every single trial. Now, some trials did have placebo arms that were what they call the standard of care, which is supportive. In COVID, that means giving them fluids, monitoring their oxygen saturation in their blood, and supporting them if their oxygen saturation drops. So that can vary from country to country, from practitioner to practitioner, and they weren't standardized. So why that's a problem is because in trials, I have to be able, if I wanted to, had tens of millions of dollars, I have to be able to redo that trial on my own, and I should be able to get the same results that they had. When they have wide differences in how they did things, we can't say that yes, this is a reproducible trial, and I can't get the same results myself. There's too many examples of trials to go, but the important thing is that they found that there were some cures, that there seems to be a suggestion that people who were on hydroxychloroquine died less, and that they potentially also didn't. That they just survived more, and too much and more than that. But the problem is that these trials are riddled. The way that they designed them were poor. They didn't include enough people, so we're talking like 60, 80 people at best. And the other thing that they found, or that the trials showed, is that they included a wide variety of people in the trials, which means that they had people that were in ICU, they had people who didn't go to ICU, they had people that were in hospital but didn't need ICU, and so it's just all over the place. And you're looking at this, how am I supposed to make anything of this? And that's kind of why it's way too difficult to sense of the data, even though it's saying, hey, this might, we can't robustly say something is good with that data. The other thing about hydroxychloroquine, so there's this one trial in Brazil, it's called the Chloro-COVID study. And so this one caught some attention for all the wrong reasons. One of hydroxychloroquine's side effects is that it can prolong this. So I'm sure your listeners, you've all seen these traces of your heart, that these waves and stuff, okay? So we call that our ECG. In that ECG trace, there's a specific measurement that we look at that's called QT interval. And you can Google what that is, but essentially if that interval gets too long, you're at risk of a fatal arrhythmia, which is, in this case, was ventricular tachycardia and also torsade de pointe, which are both can be quite fatal. In this Chloro-COVID study, I think there was 18 patients who died as a result of these arrhythmias. And it's not a joke. That's a lot of people to die in a trial that had, I think it was...
Be enrolled.
Yeah. So, yeah. And so that's quite a high mortality rate. And not to mention it's already the data, it's concerning, because now we're getting into that territory of, okay, well, if it's killing that many people, but the people, like, if we give them this drug, can we really say that they're getting better because of the drug? Or is it because where they were at in their disease course, they were already going to get better, and so the drug really had no effect on them, and all we're doing is exposing them to different harm.
I actually have some better numbers. Sorry, they before 1/4 of the planned 440 were they had to stop it. After 13 days, 6 of 40 patients in the low dose group compared with 16 of 41 patients in the high dose group. So only 81 people were, and 22 of those died. So more than a quarter.
So that's an incredibly high number.
Yeah.
The one thing I will mention about that is that we can't, so in defense of hydroxychloroquine, we can't, we can't say that hydroxychloroquine is the sole died. And this is where it gets really complicating with physiology. It looks like the hearts of these COVID patients get really, I'll call it twitchy. They don't like the fact that their body is fighting off this virus, and they're more prone to getting these arrhythmias already. It seems that that's the case. It seems that hydroxychloroquine didn't really help them and kind of tipped them over the edge, so to speak. But we don't know if those people were already going to die from that arrhythmia. It really was a hydroxychloroquine. So again, we don't know. The only real way we can do this is have a prospective trial that has multiple arms, that has a placebo arm in there as well, and that has a lot of people enrolled. Obviously, if patients are dying in this Brazilian trial, then I don't know if I would want to go on it, to be honest. But it's very difficult to say. There is one, and sorry, go ahead.
No, that's tough marketing. That's an uphill battle to sell that trial.
Oh yeah. And there's actually one kind of famous example. There was a trial that came out of France that looked at a combination of chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine rather with a couple antibiotics. The idea being that if you give the hydroxychloroquine, you can treat the COVID, and then the antibiotics on top of it they thought could have antiviral activity, but also it prevents those pneumonias from showing up, that if the COVID doesn't kill you, the pneumonia might. There were huge concerns with that trial. And it was really bad. They were moving patients around between sites and between trial arms based on the symptoms that they had. If the patient went to ICU, they removed them from the trial. There was a lot of problems, which I can't articulate in 5 seconds. So I'll be sure to send a link. There's a website that documents it all very well, and I recommend you guys check it out, because it just goes to show you problematic data can be, and how the wrong motivations can lead people to do some very questionable things.
Part of that study from France was the active treatment arm. Patients who died got excluded from the final results. Yeah. My studies would all look great if I could exclude all the bad outcomes.
Yeah, and they also had
brilliant.
It's mind blowing that even got through ethics. How did that methodology even get approved? It's just it blows my mind. I've been through the ethics process, and they go through everything you write line by line. So I don't know how this got through. But anyway.
Brought to you by the investigator, brought to you by the country that brought you the chloroquine Let's Exclude the Dead study, is now a study looking at smoking cigarettes as a treatment for COVID.
I thought that what we knew so far was very bad. I thought the people that were smoking were the more likely to die, or at least more likely to have to medical intervention.
But don't expect much.
And that actually leads me to another point, which was a well-designed trial will have obviously a lot of patients, and they can get their primary outcome that they want, but they'll also do what's called a secondary analysis, or they might do a subgroup analysis, which is basically, all right, so we had people who got the drug and didn't get the drug. Within those groups of people, let's see who the patients were. So they may have been patients who were smoking, they may have patients who had hypertension, diabetes, male, female, and they will break down all of that data for you. And then you can try and find patterns in that data. trials aren't necessarily powered to do so, which means that they don't have the right numbers and the statistics don't show that, yes, there was a true difference here, but there's suggestions. These trials, a lot of them didn't even do that. They just said, we had 80 patients. Here's what we did. We don't know anything about them. And how are you supposed to infer anything from that? So, yeah, again, problems with that. In the interest of time, I'll just move on to quickly touch on, if that's okay with you guys.
Yeah.
So there's two more drugs that are getting some attention. The first one is remdesivir, or as Trump said, remdesivir, which I thought was really funny trying to see him pronounce the name, but anyway. Remdesivir is an interesting one. So this is one of the only drugs in this entire COVID sphere that is experimental. So what that means is the FDA has not actually approved it to be used and to be sold as a regular drug. So remdesivir, they tried using it in Ebola and they didn't really find that it helped them. Now, the trouble with remdesivir, even if it was a perfect drug, which it's not, if it was a perfect drug, you can't get it very easily, especially in Canada. So the manufacturer is one company called Gilead, which is in the US. You have to get that drug through something called a compassionate access program, which means you have to apply through the manufacturer. It has to go to Health Canada as well. Lots of paperwork to get it. And the other thing is, well, you can imagine that this is not going to take a couple hours, that this can take days because it has to go through all these channels. And by that time, your patient in ICU who is intubated, who's already probably day 7 into the illness, well, if they get the remdesivir 5 days later and they get cured, does that mean the remdesivir worked? We don't know, right? So there's a lot of trouble with that piece. But let's just go through some of the data anyway. So remdesivir had interesting data. Because that this was a compassionate access drug, essentially Gilead called the shots of who got the drug. Now, we always talk about how there's, influences by drug companies in the trial. The trial author was sponsored by this company. Well, it's a bit different when the drug company is more or less cherry picking who gets their product. And obviously, for a multi-million-dollar company like Gilead, they're going to want to pick people that they think it'll work for. And so they cherry-picked patients, essentially. And that's a problem, which, again, you're not randomizing patients. And randomizing means I can assign my list of 100 patients to a number, and a computer will tell me 1 goes here, 2 goes here, 20 goes here, number 60 goes here, whatever. But when I cherry pick and put them into different groups, I'm manipulating data on the start, which is already a problem. Remdesivir, they didn't have a control group, so they just had the one group that got the drug and they said, did it work? And that last point I mentioned is that earlier, they got the drug pretty late into their illness. So they've probably run the course of the worst part of the disease on their own. And they added on top, they had the drug on top, and hooray, they got cured. So again, we can't say that remdesivir, if they start on day 1, they did well the entire way through. And it's so I don't think it's a great idea that we just start trying to stockpile this stuff. Just the amount of work that has to go on behind the scenes to get the medication, you could probably focus your time on getting the stuff we know that works for people instead. So not the frontline pharmacists, but the managers and other people focus on trying to procure masks, procure cleaning supplies, procure inhalers, procure the other stuff that we need to run the hospital instead of trying to deal with these companies to get these drugs. Yeah. So that was remdesivir.
Realize that they were actually in for those who may remember other recent pandemics such as H1N1 swine flu in 2009, Gilead was also at the center of Tamiflu, which was touted as the great for swine flu, if you recall.
Yeah, Tamiflu. I have a love-hate relationship with that drug. It's people, again, I know that we want to try and find an easy fix for the flu. As a matter of fact, there was a Japanese company, I think it was 2 years ago, they tried to come out with a drug that was a cure for the flu, essentially, that you could get your symptoms away in about a day or two. And you thought, wow, that's amazing. And their primary argument in their abstract was talking about how it would have significant economic advantages to having this drug. And think about it, right? If you have the flu, you don't feel great for a week, 2 weeks probably. So you're out of work, you're not productive. And so it would make sense that they try and get this thing going. And of course, it didn't work out that way at all. And Tamiflu on its own, for those of you who weren't aware, back in the H1N1 days, there were massive stockpiling going on. People were hoarding the drug, and people as in pharmacies and clinics and whatever, and all for an average reduction in the days of flu symptoms by 0.8 days, I think was the number. So you tell me, do you want to have a couple hours less of flu and have to pay about $60 to get a treatment for the drug? I don't know. That's not worth it to me. But anyway, that's a whole different story.
Very well. And
Depends
Gilead,
which of those days I get to cut off the 0.8. If it's a day in the middle, I'll take it.
Yeah, and so that's like not to get too off track, but it was like a total duration, right? And they actually bring up a good point, is that like in not just the COVID trials, but in also the other drugs, that's a really important point, is where in the treatment or where in the illness did we actually start to see a benefit? So even if I were to design a perfect chloroquine trial or hydroxychloroquine trial, and we see the benefit, okay, at what day? Because that's really important to know. Does it happen before the patient gets intubated and goes to ICU? Is it after? We don't know. And so that's an important point that you bring up. But yeah. So the last one is Kaletra, which is the HIV medication. So there's two ingredients to this one. It's called ritonavir and lopinavir. So lopinavir is the protease inhibitor, which means that it inhibits some of the proteins that the HIV virus will, or that it's within its machinery, will cut up sections of the virus to help it replicate better. So lopinavir blocks that. And then there's ritonavir, which is the booster. So it helps keep the levels of your lopinavir in your body for longer. As I said, it's been used in HIV, and we've been using this quite often. Now, in BC, the trouble with this drug is access. So we have a phenomenal group of people that I know and I've worked with, which is the BC Center for Excellence, which is located at St. Paul's. They're the ones who have the majority of the HIV drug supply. And that's not because they're hoarding it, it's because that's how our healthcare system is structured. That we keep it central, that they're the experts with HIV, and we let them deal with it. So they have the majority of the supply, and we can't start pulling drug from them because we have patients with HIV that need this medication. The studies seem to show some benefit, but again, the way that they're designed was not great. The other problem is that they also included this drug called ribavirin, which is used to treat hepatitis C. But the problem is that it's so poorly tolerated that people dropped out of the trial, the trials, rather. They couldn't handle the therapy. And so the number of people who started and ended the trial, there's a big discrepancy. And so when that happens, we're not okay with that because we don't know what would have happened to those people if they stayed the entire way. Maybe all those people would not have benefited from the drug. Data gets skewed and we can't make our claims and blah, blah, blah. Everything is just said earlier. So there's, again, a lot of issues with the way that the trials were reported and designed. Not to mention, one of the bigger trials from Wuhan that had 200 people, they didn't find a difference in their primary outcome. And they said that mortality was lower, but it wasn't statistically significant, which what that means is the stats that they ran, they couldn't say there is a difference between this control arm and the active arm. So when that happens, that's a no-go for us. We say then there was no difference that I gave the sugar. And everyone follows me so far on the yeah. So that's what that said. Now there's a few other drugs which are out there that they're looking at. I'll just briefly mention them. I can't talk about them because they will take a. There's Tamiflu, which we talked about. They've studied this in COVID. Colchicine, which is a medication that's used for gout, as well as a couple heart inflammation type stuff. Tocilizumab, which is an antibody medication that's supposed to interfere with that thing called the cytokine storm, which we see with COVID-19. There's a convalescent plasma, which that's a bit of a stretch of a therapy. Intravenous immunoglobulin or IVIG. Then there's corticosteroids or steroids, as they're commonly referred to them as. And then there's antibiotics as well. All of this, everything I talked about is being summarized in what's called name, which is it's called the Unproven Therapies for COVID-19 document that is published by the BC Center for Disease Control. This is published by the experts in infectious disease, internal medicine, care. These people spent a lot of time on this document. It's 30 pages long. They talk about everything I just said. I'm looking at it as we're talking. So just to show you that I definitely did not go through every single trial to get this information. I'm heavily relying off of their work. So kudos to them and kudos to all the work that they do and they're continuing to do. They're scouring the evidence every day to try and update this. So definitely check that out. And all of the trials that they cite are there and you can go and read them for yourself.
Cool.
Does it mention drinking bleach or disinfectant?
Unfortunately not. I think it'd be really effective, especially if we go with that French studies definition, because if you die, you get excluded. So,
Congratulations, you didn't die of COVID. You died from drinking bleach.
Yeah.
One immediate outcome of the internalizing light sources and disinfectant study, 3 so far states in the U.S. have reported spikes in calls to poison control centers over the weekend. And probably, I imagine this is a phenomenon that happened across many states in the U.S. that maybe didn't get reported to the media, probably because of just differences in privacy laws and so forth. But just as there were fatalities after the chloroquine beating the drug, because of course chloroquine is a common ingredient in fish tank cleaner. So there was actually a bit of a black market in fish tank cleaner on eBay. Prices soared up to 10 times the normal amount, and there were a number of fatalities from folks self-dosing with fish tank cleaner, which
Plus,
contains
fish tanks all over the world just keep getting dirtier and dirtier.
They were going
Somebody think of the
dirtier and
fishes.
dirtier.
Yeah, someone think of the goldfish. Yeah.
And a lot of pet store owners found themselves in the position of being tempted to become chop shop pharmacists, and clearly some of them succumbed. And now we're seeing just the repeat of this phenomenon. I can't wait to start reading about anorectal sunburns from UV light.
Right.
It's
Yeah,
coming.
I was
No, it's
wondering
coming.
how you inject UV light internally, and I guess that's there's one of two ways that I can think of.
We're gonna find out because
Yeah.
there will be some great case reports coming out in the next week or so.
Toren, we are finally going to get working lightsabers. Congratulations, you didn't die of COVID-19.
They're actually, on the note of things that'll come out in the next week. I don't know if it'll be that fast, but there is an emerging area of interest right now with COVID, which is something called the possible COVID-induced coagulopathy. So what that means is that they've been seeing that patients who are young, otherwise healthy, are getting strokes, and because their blood's too thick, so to speak.
Yeah.
We don't know why. Yeah, we don't know why, but the proposed ideas from the hematology people, blood doctors, they're not vampires, they're just blood doctors, but that's my joke. That was the quota for the day, so bye. But what they're saying is that it looks like they seem to be hypercoagulable, which means that their bodies are in a state which wants to clot. There's a number of blood tests that they can use to track that, but they're also non-specific for, and what I'm referring to for people in the medical community is the D-dimer sample. D-dimer is a blood test that tells us, oh, you have inflammation somewhere. But the D-dimer for us clinically points to you may have a clot building in your lungs or somewhere in your extremities. And so we find with COVID patients, the D-dimer is elevated, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a stroke or they've had a clot. Some patients do get it, and that's why they're looking into this now. What they're trying to test, and they've done this in case reports, and I don't think there's any controlled trials yet. What they've looked at is giving what's called low molecular weight heparins, or as we use in BC, enoxaparin, to see if it prevents strokes from happening. There will be some guidance coming out in the professional community in BC about that soon. I don't know enough about it right now, honestly. I actually just saw an order for this in the Nanaimo Hospital just yesterday, and we don't know enough yet. The trouble is that you may think, well, what's the harm of doing this? Well, if by preventing strokes or making your blood thin, if we make it too thin, then you can bleed and die. And so we have to be very careful. We don't, not to scare you that if you get put in a blood thinner in your life that you're going to die. It doesn't work that way. But we have to weigh the risk versus the benefit. So if the risk of you bleeding is too high, from the possible benefit you would get, we won't do it. Luckily, though, if the younger patients are the ones that seem to be at higher risk of a stroke, the younger patients, especially the ones who don't have a lot of other health issues, are generally speaking of lower bleed risk. And so we would be more okay with giving them the blood thinner to prevent the strokes than, say, a 90-year-old who comes in with COVID. Yeah, but that's essentially it. Any questions from?
There's some questions from the chat if you're up for that.
Yeah, of course.
I copied one quite a bit. Schemiel asks, I have a medication question for you. In my, a lot of the doctors have been fighting about serial medication patients showing COVID symptoms. We have a few who swear it's making a positive difference. I think it would only.
Yeah, so there are position statements on this. What I would say is treat your patients accordingly. Don't you shouldn't need to blanket prescribe patients who have COVID symptoms with antibiotics. If there are symptoms which warrant giving an antibiotic, then by all means give the antibiotic. But to do that, you have to do your proper investigations. In the name of antimicrobial stewardship, I really don't think it's a good idea to just give antibiotics willy-nilly to people. We have a serious problem of antibiotic resistance that is growing and is only going to get worse if we continue to not be judicious with our prescribing. So I don't think it's worth giving it unless there's clear symptoms that and lab tests and imaging that suggest, yes, we need to give antibiotics.
And also, you probably want to worry about running out of them too, right? I don't.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how hard, but if you start giving them to everybody, then you don't have them for.
Yeah, exactly. And the trouble as well is that if they're outpatient antibiotics, there really aren't that many that we can use that would work for the related pneumonias that come with it. And so if we just keep giving them to people, run out very quickly. And yeah, that's a great point as well.
Well, in late March, there's some data now that after the White House began beating the chloroquine drum, within a couple of days, prescriptions spiked 2 logs, so 100 times as much chloroquine was getting prescribed as the usual base rate. That will deplete the system fast.
Yeah.
Especially when you look at that as a level of increased prescribing across the entire United States.
Yeah. And really, just more of a meta comment about the pandemic. Pandemics, I'm not an epidemiologist, but my understanding is that the real problem is when the number of cases far surpass the ability of the healthcare system to keep up with them. And it's not just the lack of physical beds or the lack of tests available, it's also lack of resources. So if we lose staff because they get sick and we're out of medications, we're out of PPE, that's where we start to run into a lot of trouble. So if we start wasting hydroxychloroquine like this, then the patients who have lupus and who have rheumatoid arthritis and all the other reasons take it, they get sick and they end up in hospital, and it just leads to a chain reaction. So please. Yeah. Oh yeah. I have seen sometimes definitely is lupus. Yes. Yes. Were there any other questions in the chat?
Dr. Katie Marshall says, are there any indications of shortages in anxiety or other drugs for psychiatric conditions because of the psychological effects of quarantine?
Yeah, great question. When I checked earlier today, I didn't see any psych meds that jumped out to me that were on the list. Rob, I don't know if you've seen or heard from your colleagues of that.
So, but if you've looked directly into the eye of God, then your data is probably a lot more current than mine.
Yeah. So the only I'm just going to look at it again. There are some shortages of escitalopram, which is Cipralex, from one specific manufacturer in Canada. There are multiple manufacturers of this drug, though, so that's important to remember. There are some quetiapine shortages right now, but specifically the XR formulation, which is the long-acting quetiapine. So in the interim, if you really need to could switch to the immediate release. There is an olanzapine shortage, which is the one that dissolves on the tongue. Again, there are alternatives to this, which we can switch to. But these are the ones that are active right now. So there's 3 of them. Quetiapine, I wonder why on shortage. And it looks like it's all strengths of quetiapine. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, if I recall correctly, the data for XR versus IR. Now we're talking inside baseball, but wasn't that sexy? So
yeah.
They flogged it anyway, but I never thought the data was that impressive.
Yeah, and if I may, just a quick point about what BC is doing to combat the drug shortages is that the College of Pharmacists has set restrictions on exactly how many pills you can go get from a pharmacy. So before, you could get a 3-month supply or even a year supply of medication if your doctor gave you the prescription. Now it's being restricted to 1 month supply at a time. That way, you can't just fill that 1 year supply of thiopine, for example. Now, that might sound good, but you have to remember that the pharmacies and the pharmacists are compensated using what's called a dispensing fee. That adds a problem because pharmacare doesn't cover a bunch of dispensing fees in a year for one drug. And right now, BC has not announced what they're going to do. And why that's important. So if you're to get a prescription for a 90-day supply of, let's just say, warfarin, as an example, which is a blood thinner, you would only pay 1 dispensing fee for the 90 days. But now, if we're doing 30-day restrictions, you pay 3 dispensing fees, which they are sometimes $10, $12, and the cheapest is Costco, which is like $4.50 or something. But the government will only cover so much, and then the rest is put onto you or onto your insurance. So luckily, though, Nova Scotia has said that they're actually going to pay for those extra dispensing fees that people incur. And they just announced, I think it was today or yesterday, and hopefully the other provinces follow suit with that. But we have to wait and see.
She was repeated exposure to pharmacists who are really, in terms of lack of PPE, I pity the poor retail pharmacist who's last in line to get masks and respirators and now having to dispense monthly. So in a lot of cases, tripling their volume and tripling their number of exposures.
Yeah, I have a pharmacist friend who works behind the counter, and she said she's being shouted at a lot more by her customers recently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a number of friends who are community pharmacists, and just to speak for them, really, please call if you have questions. You don't need to go in for every single question that you have. Only go in to pick up medications. Obviously, if you have other symptoms, you need to access healthcare. Of course, go in to see a pharmacist. But you don't need to hoard Tylenol. You don't need to hoard Advil. Really, you don't need to. Just if you have questions and you're unsure, always call, and then they'll tell you what you should do.
Becomes to your friendly neighborhood pharmacist.
Yes, yeah.
So, Toren, it's time for your segment. Give us some good news.
What you got for us, Toren?
Good news. Well, I was just going to point out that there was news a week or two ago about the Vancouver Aquarium being in risk of going out of business because there's no tourism anymore. And that was upsetting. But then I heard that they not only have they been getting a bunch of just donations from various independent people and also from other countries as well. But they also started doing this mask business. They teamed up with the Whitecaps, and they are selling masks, Vancouver Aquarium and Whitecaps face masks. and they've sold over 42,000 masks in the first 2 days for a fundraiser.
Mm-hmm.
So things are looking better for the Vancouver Aquarium. Now they're not quite out of the woods, as they say, but I just wanted to bring attention to this good news and promote you can go to the Vancouver Aquarium gift shop and order a mask if you don't want to make your own, or if you want to support the aquarium.
Whitecaps being our local professional soccer team.
Yes,
for those
that's
who
right.
aren't aware of that.
Yeah,
So that's good.
The mask that you wanted to put up on the screen, or have you done that already?
Oh, sure. Let's see what I can do here.
I believe in you, Toren. Hey, there we go.
Do you see it?
There
Yep.
it is.
I can hold on. I'll full screen you there. There we go. Let's turn off the names. There we go. So yeah.
So if you want to see more happy penguins walking up and down the stairs from the Vancouver Aquarium, buy a mask.
And you do.
You certainly do. I certainly do. Please buy those masks so I can continue to enjoy these videos. Now, was there a second segment you had? You mentioned that there were two.
Did I say that?
I don't know.
Oh yes, that's right. I did in Australia, because they're the tour. There again, there's no tourism. The country's tour boats are sitting empty, but some of the companies are repurposing their idle vessels and staff for coral restoration missions along the Great Barrier Reef.
Oh.
Tour companies are donating their catamarans and fuel to take scientists out to the reef. It's the first time on the Great Barrier Reef that tourism operators have worked alongside researchers, and the first time that a coral clip has been used to attach corals to the reef. That involves finding coral fragments that have naturally broken off and attaching them back on the reef. So there is some good news if you're a fish.
We've got some good news here in Vancouver as well. The homeless are going to be housed in empty hotels. They're taking the people who are all crowded down at the Vancouver's East End, which even now, homeless people don't have anywhere to go, and they're literally crowding on the streets. You've seen video of them there. They're not doing the 6-foot thing. And so hotels are all empty because nobody's coming anywhere. So the government is finally giving them a place to stay. Hopefully they will have a place to stay after this is all over as well.
Awesome.
I'll throw the link up in chat for anybody who wants to take a look at that. And apologies if anybody can hear my roommate screaming in the background now.
Oh, I couldn't hear it. I'm listening for it now.
Well, so I honestly, sometimes when she plays that game, I think she's being attacked. And she is in the game, but it sounds like somebody has broken into her room and is assaulting her. And it sets off all of my, I got to do something. Oh, it's her playing a game again. Okay. I have to calm myself down.
What it used to be.
This is
it's not even necessarily entertaining.
No, and not after months of it either. Anyway.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show, Sasha.
Yeah,
that was great.
you, Sasha.
No worries. Thank you, guys. And I really do appreciate you guys putting this show out and trying to inform the public. It's really helpful. And yeah, really all I can say is we appreciate everything that everyone's doing by staying at home and trying to make life for us hospital people a bit easier. And thank you guys for all of your work. Yeah, by all means, feel free to ask questions. I'll get you my contact info, and you guys can post it up there.
Awesome.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
So for everybody else who's still watching, we're going to do some Jackbox games after this. We're going to shut the stream down. Once the stream is down, I'm going to throw up an invite to my Discord server. You can only play in the game if you're on the Discord server, but we will also be streaming it to Twitch, so you can watch or join the audience if you're there. As usual, we're at viraltransmissions.com. I'm trying to get all of these old shows up to YouTube. It's kind of a pain to get done. I just put up the last one. We are also now a podcast, so if you would prefer to just get this as the audio version, so you don't get to see our beautiful faces, you can do that. We should be on all the podcast places now. You can sign up on Google Podcasts or iTunes or things like that. There is a delay because it is a lot of work to get this down and turn it into audio and that kind of thing. So live is the best way to do it. Also, please help us out by telling your friends. Tell people about Viral Transmissions. Encourage them to come and hang out in chat, because Twitch does a lot of good things for us when they see that our chat is active. Also, if you have Prime, you can subscribe, and that will get you that cool icon that you can put in chat, which some of you soda jerks might appreciate having access to. And you can then use it in any Twitch chat stream, the Caustic Soda logo icon. So I guess that's it. Anybody else have anything to add before we sign off?
Yep. Spread the word, not the virus.
Yeah, please spread the word, not the virus.
What he said.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Nice. Oh, and Toren, check that out.
It's Hokusai, Tidal Wave, and
Cthulhu.
oh, I can't. It's too tiny for me to see.
There we go.
Oh yes, I see the tentacles now. Very nice.
Yeah.
The madness is